Well, if you remember, we talked about at the beginning of the War of 1812 how it was kind of a sideshow to the British because they were fighting Napoleon in Europe, and that was the main conflict. That was what they were pouring all of their resources into. Well, in April of 1814, Napoleon had finally been defeated, and he had abdicated the throne, which meant no more war in Europe, which also meant that Britain could focus still the greatest navy and greatest military force in the world entirely on us. It wasn't exactly a brilliant condition for us to be in. And so Britain began planning a four-pronged attack. The idea was this: they would divide their enormous forces into four, and they would attack us at Niagara Falls, they would attack us at Lake Champlain, they would attack us at the Chesapeake, and they would also attack us at the great city of New Orleans. Let me go ahead and walk you through what happened at each of these. First of all, at Niagara Falls. It was at Niagara Falls that the British came head-to-head with our militias, who actually defended and fought quite nobly. In fact, there were several bayonet charges exchanged here. And it was due to the actions of one Colonel James Miller, who ordered his men to charge the British while they were reloading using just the bayonet. He suffered a 50% casualty rating amongst his men. But the British were so demoralized by it that they surrendered. Not only that, but these were veterans who had fought against the French, against Napoleon's men in places like Spain and France. And these were men who said that after this charge, that was the greatest thing they had ever seen in any battle. So it gives you an idea of how incredible that charge must have been. It would make quite a movie if you want to make a film about it. At Lake Champlain, the British again tried to send down a flotilla, thus to invade and take over the various water bodies that come out of Lake Champlain. But it was due to one Captain MacDonough, another great Scotch-Irish hero, who on his ship, the Saratoga, even though it lost 20% of its men, he managed to turn it at anchor and then go into direct head-on fighting with the British ship, killed the British commander on board his flagship, at which point the British surrendered. Now, at the Chesapeake, things were not quite fought as well. In fact, it was at the Chesapeake that the commander, a man by the name of General Ross, fighting for the British, led his soldiers into Washington, D.C. Now, D.C. was defended by militiamen, but the militiamen tended to resent the mercantilist war, and they saw D.C. as leading it, and so militiamen fought for a little while and then just said, let's go home. And so Ross was able to waltz into Washington, D.C., and he set fire to our White House and to our Capitol. In fact, the White House would have had most of its fine furniture and fine documents and paintings lost had it not been for the work of James Madison, never mind, not James Madison, he ran off earlier. It had not been the work of Dolly Madison. His wife was the one who actually saved everything. It's one of the great tales of Madison and really shows you how he wasn't exactly the greatest leader. His wife actually was, though. But then Ross turned his attention to Baltimore and attempted to use his forces to take over that city. But it was there at Baltimore the militiamen fought for their homes, and they fought with a renewed vigor. And so they easily defeated Ross, who had to retreat. And it was there also that on board a prison, Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner as he watched them bombard Fort McHenry. Meanwhile, the British also would attack down at New Orleans. It was here that the decisive blow would occur. The British, who were led by a General Pakenham, had some 11,000 redcoats led by a special forces unit of Scotsmen. These were guys from the Highlands. These were the guys who usually carried those claymores behind them, who had won the battle at the Plains of Abraham something like a half-century before this. They were also supported by sea. Meanwhile, in the city of New Orleans, it was not well defended, at least in terms of numbers. There were only about 4,000 in the roughly American army that was defending the city of New Orleans. And they were made up of some American regular soldiers, but also several militiamen, several over-mountain men using antiquated guns, as well as several free Africans and several pirates who donated their cannon to the defense of the city. And so it was expected that General Pakenham and the British would be in New Orleans by Christmas. In fact, Pakenham wrote a letter to Andrew Jackson, who was commanding the American army, that he expected to have his Christmas dinner at the finest house in the city of New Orleans. Jackson wrote him back, saying famously, "Yes, you can have Christmas dinner. I will be sitting at the head of the table, though." And so Jackson had an incredible faith that somehow he would win here, even though most of the residents of New Orleans had already fled. Meanwhile, with the lines drawn up, by the time January of 1815 came around, one man on the side of the Americans decided there was no way that his side could win, and so he deserted, betrayed his nation, went over to the British, and told them that right in the center of the American lines, where the flag stood, that was the weak point. That was where those over-mountain men and the free Africans and the pirates were. Those were the guys who had old weapons and who weren't disciplined and who weren't well trained. And so the British thought, he's right. We'll attack there. It's the weak link. And so they began to send in all of their forces, led by the Scotsmen. Meanwhile, the Americans began to use their 32-pounder cannons loaded with scrap iron and shot them at the British forces who were charging across open ground. And those over-mountain men and those free Africans and those pirates sharpshooted the British officers. As a result, by the end of the day, some 540 of the Highlanders were dead. There would be over 2,500 casualties on the British side. General Pakenham was himself killed in the action. On the American side, only 13 actually died. It's one of the most lopsided victories in the history of the world. That deserter was hung by the British before they left. Soon Jackson learned that the war had been ended on Christmas Eve of the previous year, because the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, but news had not been brought to New Orleans yet. With that news brought to New Orleans, the war had ended, and the treaty returned everything to what they called the status quo ante bellum. In other words, everything went back to the way it had been before the war, and no one gained anything. That's the nature of a mercantilist war. It pursues something that is not justly its, and it actually loses even more than it had at the beginning. We'll consider this as we view other lessons.